The 10 years of silence. The land stretched wide and merciless under the pale sweep of a winter sky, the kind that bleached the earth into shades of bone and ash. Snow had not yet fallen, but the cold lay heavy, pressing into the timbers of the lonely ranch house and groaning through the cracks as if the wind itself had learned to mourn. On the ridge beyond the corral, bare cottonwoods rattled their skeletal branches, each gust shaking loose a hollow sound that carried down to the valley floor where cattle moved like dark shadows against the brittle grass. This was the country of silence, endless, unforgiving, and wild. And it was here, 10 years to the month since his wife's death, that Eli Granger lived as though he were one of its ghosts. He had once been a man of laughter, though none now living in the town of Redford could remember it. They knew him only as the silent rancher who came into town twice a month, once for supplies, once for business with the bank, and spoke to no one unless forced. He was not unkind, but there was a hollowness about him, a weight that kept his shoulders bowed and his hat brim pulled low. In the saloon, whispers always rose after he left, about the wife who died in childbirth, about the child who had not drawn breath, about how Eli had buried them both in the same frozen ground and never again let anyone close. The ranch kept him alive, and that was all. His cattle fed him, his hands obeyed him, but his heart was long buried in that small grave under the cottonwood tree. The house reflected its master. The walls were solid but weathered, the hearthstone blackened with soot, the shelves bare of any ornaments save for a cracked ceramic jug and a faded Bible no one had touched in years. In the upstairs bedroom, her dress still hung in the wardrobe. Untouched by moths thanks to cedar blocks he replaced each year with mechanical devotion. He did not speak to her spirit, not openly, yet there were nights when the loneliness pressed too hard and he would sit at the edge of that bed, fingers brushing the empty quilt, whispering apologies to the woman whose face he could scarcely remember except in dreams. Eli's life had become a ritual of endurance. At dawn he rode fence lines repairing sagging wire. By noon he checked the herds, driving strays back toward the main pasture. At dusk he sat with ledger books by lamplight, scribbling numbers that never seemed to turn in his favor. The drought years had bled him nearly dry. Cattle prices fell, rustlers prowled, and the bank, merciless as any outlaw, kept demanding payment. He was too proud to sell, too stubborn to quit, and so he went on, year after lonely year, a man made of grit and ghosts. But the West had a way of stirring fate when least expected. It came one morning in late November, when the frost still clung to the corral rails and Eli trudged toward the barn with his coat collar turned high. A rider approached from the east, a stagecoach cresting the ridge and rattling down the trail in a plume of dust and cold air. He frowned. Coaches seldom came this way unless carrying mail, and he had received no letter in years. The driver slowed, cracking the reins, and the door swung open. From within stepped a woman wrapped in a travel-stained shawl, her figure straight though her clothes bore the mark of long miles. She paused on the step, her eyes sweeping the barren valley before finding him across the yard. "Eli," she said, her voice trembling not from cold but from something deeper. "It's me, Clara." For a moment he could not place her. The years had carved lines into her face, soft though they were, and streaked her brown hair with threads of gray. Then recognition struck like a blow. Clara, his wife's younger sister, the girl who had been there at the wedding, who had wept at the graveside, who had vanished eastward to marry some railroad man he had never met. He had not seen her in over a decade. "What are you doing here?" His voice came rough, unused to speaking more than a handful of words at once. The driver set her trunk in the dust and tipped his hat before turning the team back toward town, leaving her standing small and alone in the vastness of the yard. Clara drew her shawl tighter and stepped forward. "My husband is dead. Consumption took him. I had nowhere else to go." Her words hung between them, simple and shattering. Eli felt the ground tilt beneath him. He had long ago sealed his heart against surprise, yet here it was, a piece of the past alive and breathing, standing in the shadow of his lonely house. He thought of the whispers that would spread in Redford, of the judgment of neighbors who still muttered about curses and God's punishment. His jaw clenched. "You should have written," he muttered. "I did," she answered softly, her eyes searching his. "Perhaps the letter never reached you." He looked away toward the barren fields. He wanted to send her back, to refuse the upheaval she carried with her. Yet even as the thought rose, another followed. The long winters alone, The cold suppers eaten in silence, the gnawing hollow that no cattle herd could fill. Against his will, something stirred in his chest, something like the ache of a long-forgotten flame. "Come inside," he said at last, his voice heavy with reluctance. "We'll talk." The house seemed to hold its breath as she crossed the threshold. For the first time in 10 years, the silence was broken by the sound of a woman's steps echoing on the wooden floorboards. She set her shawl aside, revealing features weathered but still carrying a beauty that was no less striking for its age. Her eyes, the same gray as her sister's, studied the rooms with a mixture of sorrow and memory. "You kept it just the same," she murmured. Eli did not answer. He busied himself with the fire, adding logs and poking the embers until sparks leapt up the chimney. His hands trembled slightly, though whether from the cold or from her presence he could not say. He felt her gaze on his back, steady, unyielding, as though she sought to read the years of solitude carved into his frame. "I won't be a burden," she said finally, breaking the silence. "I can work. I can cook, mend, tend stock if need be. I only ask for a roof while I find my bearings." He turned then, meeting her eyes. In them he saw not pity but determination, the same steel that had kept him alive on this desolate land. Something inside him softened, though he kept his face stern. "You can stay," he said, "for a while." She nodded, relief flickering across her features. But beneath it he caught another expression, something guarded, something unspoken. And though he pushed the thought aside, a quiet unease stirred within him, whispering that her arrival was no accident of circumstance. That night, after she had gone to bed in the spare room, Eli sat alone by the fire. The flames cast shifting light across the walls, revealing shadows that seemed almost human in their shape. He poured a measure of whiskey, though he seldom drank, and stared into the dark corners of the room. Clara's presence unsettled him. She was kin, yes, but she was also a reminder of what he had lost, a mirror of his wife's face aged by grief and time. And in the way she had looked at him, steady and unwavering, he sensed something that both frightened and drew him. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. He lifted his glass in a silent toast to the grave under the cottonwood, whispering words no one else could hear. Then he drank, the firelight flickering against the hollow planes of his face, as the first stirrings of change swept across the barren ranch like the breath of an oncoming storm. The sister arrives. The days that followed Clara's arrival were unlike any Eli had known in years. For a decade, the ranch had echoed with only the sounds of cattle lowing in the distance, boots against wooden floors, and the hollow scrape of cutlery against tin plates. Now other sounds slipped into the silence, soft footsteps on the stairs, the quiet hum of a woman's voice as she moved about the kitchen, the faint rustle of skirts brushing against door frames. They were small, ordinary things, yet to Eli they were disorienting, like the first notes of music breaking into a room that had long forgotten song. Clara wasted no time in claiming her place within the house. She rose early, before dawn's first light cut across the horizon and stoked the fire to life. By the time Eli came in from the yard, shaking frost from his coat, the smell of biscuits and bacon drifted through the air. He stood in the doorway watching her move about the kitchen, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair pinned back hastily from her face. She was not the girl he remembered, no longer the bright-eyed sister with a quick laugh, but she carried herself with a quiet confidence born of hardship. The loss of her husband had carved sorrow into her features, but beneath it he sensed a strength that startled him. At first he tried to keep his distance, wary of the way her presence unsettled the careful rhythm of his days. He ate in silence, offering only curt nods of thanks. He avoided her gaze at the table, focusing instead on the worn grain of the wood or the steam curling from his coffee. Yet Clara seemed unbothered by his reticence. She spoke softly of practical matters, the dwindling supplies, the state of the barn roof, the mending of clothes. She did not press him for conversation, but when she did glance up, her eyes lingered with a steadiness that made his chest tighten. The townsfolk noticed her almost immediately. Redford was small, and news traveled on the wind faster than stagecoaches could carry it. By the time Eli rode in for feed supplies, whispers followed him down Main Street like burrs clinging to a saddle blanket. Men tipped their hats politely enough, but their eyes slid toward the wagon where Clara sat, wrapped against the cold, her face turned toward the dusty storefronts with a look of quiet defiance. Women gathered at the mercantile door, murmuring behind gloved hands. Eli ignored them, jaw clenched, though the heat of their judgment burned through his coat as surely as fire. Inside the mercantile, old Mrs. Harper leaned over the counter with the keen sharpness of a hawk. "Back with company this time, Eli?" she asked, her voice syrupy but her eyes sharp. "My sister-in-law," Eli replied, setting down his list. "She's widowed. She'll be staying a while." Mrs. Harper's lips pursed into a thin line. "Ah, I see." She said no more, but the weight of her silence carried louder than words. By the time Eli and Clara returned to the wagon, half the town had already drawn its conclusions. That night, Clara seemed aware of the storm her presence stirred. She sat by the fire, mending one of Eli's shirts, her needle glinting in the lamplight. "They'll talk," she said quietly, not looking up. "They always do," Eli muttered. He was stretched in the chair opposite, boots crossed at the ankle, eyes fixed on the flames. She paused, thread taut between her fingers. "It doesn't trouble you?" He gave a humorless snort. "It used to. Not anymore. 10 years of silence teaches a man not to give a damn about whispers." Clara set her sewing aside then, folding her hands in her lap. The firelight caught the curve of her cheek, the soft weariness around her eyes. "Still, I don't want to shame you." Or her memory. Her words struck deep. For a long moment, Eli said nothing, staring into the flames as if they might offer him answers. At last he spoke, his voice low. "Her memory is mine to guard, not theirs." Their eyes met across the fire, and in that silence something unspoken passed between them, something that stirred like the first warm breath of spring beneath snow. Eli looked away quickly, rising to fetch more wood, but the echo of her gaze lingered in his chest long after the fire had burned low. The first storm of the season came suddenly, rolling down from the mountains with a fury that rattled the very bones of the valley. One moment the sky was clear, pale with the bite of winter, and the next it was swallowed by black clouds that tore open with snow. By dusk the ranch lay buried under a blanket of white, the wind howling like wolves across the ridges. Eli secured the shutters, checked the barn doors twice, and brought the horses in close. When he stepped back inside, snow clung to his beard, his coat stiff with ice. Clara met him at the door with a lantern, her face pale but steady. "It's bad out there." "Bad enough," he replied, stomping snow from his boots. "We'll be stuck a few days, maybe more." The storm sealed them into the house as surely as a prison. The wind screamed through the night, tearing at the walls, rattling the roof. Eli sat by the fire, boots drying by the hearth, while Clara moved quietly around the room, tidying dishes, refilling the kettle, straightening blankets. When at last she sat down across from him, the silence pressed heavy. Outside, the world was nothing but swirling white, endless and suffocating. Inside, the fire cast shadows that danced across the walls, throwing their faces into stark relief. Eli found himself studying her without meaning to. The slope of her shoulders, the determined set of her jaw, the faint trembling of her hands though she tried to hide it. She noticed his gaze and lifted her chin, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that made his breath falter. "I didn't come here only because I was alone," she said suddenly, her voice low but clear. He stiffened. "What do you mean?" Clara's eyes held his, unflinching. "I came because of you." The words fell like stones into a pond, rippling through the silence. Eli's chest tightened, his throat dry. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unable to summon words. "I loved you once," she continued, her voice trembling now, though her gaze did not waver. "Long before you married her. I never spoke it. I buried it as I was meant to. But when I lost everything, my husband, my home, I realized what I had left. What I had always carried." The fire crackled, filling the silence between them. Eli felt as though the very ground had shifted beneath his feet, the storm outside echoing the storm within. His heart pounded with guilt, confusion, and something more dangerous, desire. He clenched his fists against it, his voice hoarse when at last he spoke. "You shouldn't say such things, perhaps," she whispered, but I could not keep silent forever. For a long time neither spoke. The storm raged outside, battering the shutters, shaking the timbers. Inside, two souls sat locked in silence, bound by grief, by memory, and now by a confession that could not be taken back. And as the wind howled through the night, Eli knew with a terrible certainty that nothing on this ranch or in his heart would ever be the same again. The outlaw's shadow. The storm passed, leaving the ranch wrapped in a deep and merciless silence. Snow lay heavy across the fields, a white shroud that muffled the sound of cattle and deadened the clatter of hooves. For days, Eli and Clara worked side by side, digging paths to the barn, breaking ice at the water troughs and shaking snow from sagging fences. The labor was grueling, and yet it carried with it a strange new rhythm. For the first time in a decade, Eli was not alone in the daily battle against the elements. The sound of Clara's voice calling to the horses, laughing softly when snow fell from a branch onto her shoulders, warmed something inside him he had thought forever frozen. But peace never lingered long in the frontier. By the second week of December, when the snow began to thaw and muddy trails wound back toward Redford, word came down the valley of trouble. A rancher named Foster rode out from town, his face bruised, his hat lost somewhere in the scuffle. He found Eli at the fence line and wasted no time. "They're back," Foster said, spitting blood into the snow. "Murdoch's gang. Rode in bold as brass, demanded tribute same as last year, said they'll burn any ranch that won't pay." Eli's jaw tightened. He remembered Murdoch well, a thick-set outlaw with a grin like a wolf's who'd been run out of Wyoming and taken to terrorizing small homesteads along the borderlands. Years ago he had come sniffing around Eli's ranch, demanding cattle in exchange for protection. Eli had refused, pistol in hand, and the outlaws had slunk off with promises of revenge. He had half believed them dead or gone. Now they had returned, stronger and hungrier. "I won't give them a damn thing," Eli said flatly. Foster shook his head. "That's what I told him too. Cost me a tooth. Mark my words, they'll be coming this way. Careful, Eli, they'll take what they want, woman included." The words lit a fire in Eli's chest. He dismissed Foster with a curt nod, but long after the man rode off, the warning echoed. He had weathered 10 years of solitude with no one to fear for but himself. Now Clara's presence made every threat sharper, every danger more dire. That evening, as the sun bled red over the snowy ridges, he told Clara what Foster had said. She was seated by the fire, darning a sock, but she set her work aside and looked him squarely in the eye. "Then we'll fight," she said simply. Eli blinked at her. "You don't understand. Murdoch isn't some drunken cowhand looking for trouble. He's a killer, and his men are no better. This isn't your fight." Her jaw hardened, a flash of steel in her gray eyes. "Everything I have is gone, Eli. My husband, my home, the life I built back east. I came here with nothing but my hands. If this ranch falls, I fall with it. Don't you dare tell me it's not my fight." Her words struck him with unexpected force. She was not the fragile widow he had feared she might be. There was a resilience in her, a grit born not of the frontier but of surviving sorrow. Against his better judgment, he felt pride stir within him. The next morning, Clara proved her resolve. While Eli checked the herd, she took down his late wife's old Winchester rifle from the rack above the mantel. The gun was heavy, the stock worn smooth with use. She carried it out to the yard, squared her shoulders, and leveled it at a barrel 50 paces away. Eli returned just in time to see her fire. The shot cracked through the crisp air, startling the cattle. The bullet missed, kicking up snow and dirt. She did not flinch, did not apologize, just reloaded, steadier this time. The second shot struck the barrel square, echoing across the valley. Eli stood frozen, a strange mix of awe and unease in his chest. She turned toward him then, eyes fierce, smoke curling from the barrel. "If Murdoch comes," she said, "he'll find I'm no easy prey." In that moment, Eli saw her not as his wife's younger sister, not as the widow in need of shelter, but as something entirely new, an equal, a partner, a woman of iron and fire, and it terrified him. The threat of Murdoch's gang hung over the ranch like a thundercloud. Days stretched into uneasy nights. Eli patrolled the fence lines, rifle slung across his back, watching the horizon for dust trails. Clara kept busy with the stock, her presence both a comfort and a constant reminder of the danger pressing in on them. One night, as the wind moaned through the shutters, Eli sat at the table cleaning his revolver. Clara set down a plate of stew before him and lingered at his side. He felt the warmth of her presence, the faint brush of her sleeve against his arm. "You're burning yourself out," she said softly. "I've no choice," he muttered. "If Murdoch comes, I'll be ready." She hesitated, then touched his shoulder. The contact jolted him as surely as a spark from the fire. He looked up into her face. So close, eyes bright in the lamplight, lips parted as though on the edge of words she dared not speak. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still, the silence between them heavy with things neither had the courage to voice. Then Eli pulled back sharply, the chair scraping against the floor. "Don't," he said hoarsely. You don't know what you're doing." Hurt flickered across her face, but she lifted her chin with quiet dignity. "I know exactly what I'm doing, and I know what I feel." He turned away, fists clenched, breath ragged. He wanted to shout, to deny it, to remind her of the grave under the cottonwood and the vows he had once spoken. But the truth pressed against him with relentless force. He wanted her. And that truth shamed him as much as it set his blood to fire. The first sign of Murdoch's gang came at dawn 3 days later. Smoke rose on the northern ridge, black against the pale sky. Eli saddled his horse in grim silence, rifle strapped across his back. Clara appeared at his side, the Winchester in her hands. "You stay here," he told her. Her eyes narrowed. "No, Clara, no," she repeated, steel in her voice. "If they mean to burn this ranch, they'll have to look me in the eye while they do it." There was no arguing with her. Together they rode to the ridge, snow crunching beneath hooves, breath steaming in the cold air, and as they crested the rise, Eli's worst fears were confirmed. Murdoch and his men, 5 of them in all, circling a neighbor's homestead where smoke still rose from smoldering timbers. A warning, a promise of what would come. Murdoch himself turned in the saddle, his wolfish grin spreading wide as he spotted Eli. "Well, well," he called across the snow. "The silent rancher. 10 years we've been waiting. Looks like you found yourself some company." His gaze slid to Clara, lingering with a hunger that made Eli's blood boil. She met it without flinching, rifle steady across her lap. The outlaw laughed. "Careful, Granger. A woman like that. Shame to see her left undefended." Eli's hand tightened on the reins, fury coursing hot through his veins. "Set foot on my land, Murdoch, and I'll put you in the ground." Murdoch only laughed louder, the sound carrying cold across the snow. "We'll see, rancher. We'll see." And with that, the gang wheeled their horses and vanished into the trees, leaving behind the charred ruin of the neighbor's home and the promise of blood yet to come. Eli sat rigid in the saddle, heart hammering, Clara silent at his side. He knew now the storm had truly come, and no amount of silence or solitude could hold it back. Love and betrayal. The smoke of Murdoch's warning lingered in the valley for days, as though the land itself could not forget the violence written upon it. Eli rode the pastures with rifle across his lap, every shadow a threat, every sound of wind through the cottonwoods a whisper of hooves on the approach. Clara worked without complaint, splitting kindling, hauling water, tending to the cattle, her hands blistered but steady. Yet though she moved through the chores with practiced resolve, Eli could see in her eyes the weight of what hung over them. The silence of the ranch was no longer the silence of solitude. It was the silence before a storm breaks. When Eli took her into town for supplies, the unease followed them. The whispers that once slid quietly behind their backs now grew bolder, sharpened by tongues that tasted scandal. At the mercantile, Mrs. Harper muttered to a friend within earshot. "Shameless, that's what it is. Her sister in the ground and she living under his roof as if nothing were sacred." At the livery, one of Murdoch's sympathizers spat into the dirt and called out, "How's the widow keeping you warm, Granger?" The laughter that followed was low and mean, the kind that made a man's fists clench and his blood burn. Eli kept his temper in check, but each word sliced deep. The West was a land where a man's reputation weighed more than gold, and scandal could ruin quicker than fire. Yet when he caught Clara's eyes, calm, unflinching, her chin lifted against the storm, something inside him steadied. She bore the judgment without shame, and in her defiance he found the strength to do the same. Still, the pressure mounted. The town preacher rode out one cold evening, his black coat stark against the snow. He sat tall in the saddle, his face a stern mask of righteousness. Eli met him at the gate, hand resting on the butt of his revolver, though he knew no bullets would silence this kind of threat. "Brother Granger," the preacher began, voice booming with the authority of Scripture, "it has come to my attention that you keep your wife's sister under your roof, and tongues wag with talk of impropriety. This cannot stand. God's house does not suffer sin to thrive unchecked. Send her away lest you both find yourselves condemned." Eli's jaw tightened. "She's family," he growled, "and she's got nowhere else to go." The preacher's eyes narrowed. "There are widows' homes in Santa Fe, shelters in Denver, places proper and fit for a woman to live, not under the roof of the man who once shared her sister's bed." The word struck like a hammer blow. Eli's knuckles whitened on the gatepost, rage burning hot, but Clara stepped forward before he could speak. She faced the preacher squarely, her gray eyes unyielding. I buried a husband already, she said. I've no intention of being buried by your judgment too. If the Lord condemns me for seeking shelter where I may, then let him do so himself. I'll not tremble before men who pretend to speak for him. For a moment the preacher faltered, his mouth snapping shut at her defiance. Then with a dark glare he wheeled his horse and rode off, his words trailing behind him like smoke. You'll regret this folly, both of you. God's wrath falls swift. When the sound of hooves faded, Eli turned to her, torn between fury and admiration. She stood tall, shoulders squared, but he saw the faint tremble in her hands once the preacher was gone. Without thinking, he reached for her, steadying her fingers in his own. She looked up and the world seemed to fall silent around them. The air between them shifted that night. What had once been unspoken now burned with urgency. Each glance lingering longer, each brush of hands sparking fire. Eli fought it with all the strength of a man who had buried his heart 10 years before, but the more he resisted, the stronger the pull became. Clara moved through the house like a storm contained, her presence everywhere, her scent clinging to the blankets, her voice filling corners that had known only silence. He could not escape her, and deep down he no longer wished to. The breaking point came with fire. Murdoch struck just before midnight, the sky lit with the glow of burning timber as the barn went up in flames. Eli woke to the crackle of fire and Clara's scream. He snatched his rifle and tore into the yard, heat blistering against his face. The cattle bawled in terror, shadows darting at the edges of the blaze, Murdoch's men laughing as they scattered into the night. Shots rang out, bullets thudding into wood. Eli fired back, driving them off, but by the time the smoke cleared, the barn lay in ruins, embers hissing in the snow. He sank to his knees in the ash, chest heaving with fury and grief. The barn had been his pride, built with his own hands, and now it was nothing but cinders. Clara knelt beside him, her face streaked with soot, her hands gripping his shoulders as though she could hold him upright by will alone. "You're still here," she whispered fiercely, her voice breaking. "That's what matters. You're still here." He turned toward her, and in the flickering glow of ruin, something inside him gave way. 10 years of silence, 10 years of buried grief, 10 years of pushing away every scrap of tenderness, gone in an instant. His hands rose to cup her face, rough palms against her ash-smeared skin, and before he could think better of it, his mouth was on hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was raw, desperate, a collision of grief and desire and longing too long denied. She clung to him as though afraid he might vanish, her lips answering his with equal fire. Around them the barn smoldered, cattle lowed, sparks drifted into the night sky. But for that moment, nothing existed beyond the heat of her mouth, the salt of her tears, the terrible release of a love forbidden yet unstoppable. When at last they broke apart, both trembling, Eli pressed his forehead against hers, his breath ragged. "God forgive me," he whispered. "I can't fight it anymore." Clara's hands slid to his chest, gripping the fabric of his shirt as if anchoring herself. "There's nothing to forgive," she said, her voice fierce. "We've both buried enough ghosts. Let them rest." And in the ashes of what had been, they found the beginning of something new, something dangerous, something condemned by law and scripture and neighbor alike, yet something that burned brighter than the fire that had destroyed the barn. Blood and justice. The morning after the barn burned, the ranch felt hollow, as though the fire had stripped it not only of wood and hay, but of the very marrow that held it upright. Smoke still curled from blackened beams, stinging Eli's eyes when he walked the ruins. The cattle paced restlessly in the yard, unsettled by the loss, their lowing echoing like mournful voices through the valley. Clara moved silently among them, her face pale, her hair streaked with ash she had not bothered to wash away. Every so often her gaze drifted toward Eli, and though no words passed between them, he felt her presence like a constant tether against despair. But Murdoch had not finished with them. By dusk that same day, as shadows bled long across the snow, riders crested the ridge. 5 of them, dark shapes against the setting sun, came thundering down into the yard. Eli grabbed his rifle, heart hammering, but they were too quick. Gunfire exploded, splinters of wood flying from the fence posts. Clara screamed as 2 men dismounted and seized her by the arms. Eli fired, dropping one outlaw where he stood, but a blow from behind sent him sprawling into the dirt. By the time he staggered to his feet, Clara was slung across a saddle, Murdoch's grin cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Your move, rancher," the outlaw leader shouted, his voice ringing across the yard. "Come find us if you've got the sand." or let her scream herself hoarse in the canyon. And then they were gone, hooves pounding into the distance, leaving Eli standing in the trampled snow with rage burning hotter than the flames that had taken his barn. For a moment he could not move. His body shook, blood seeping from a cut at his temple, breath ragged in his chest. He looked around at the wreckage, shattered fences, a dead outlaw bleeding into the snow, cattle scattered in terror. Clara's cry still echoed in his ears, a sound that seared his heart more deeply than any wound. And in that moment, a decade of silence, of solitude, of burying his soul in the dirt of the ranch cracked apart. The world had taken his wife, his child, his barn, his peace. It would not take Clara. He saddled his horse in grim silence, loading his rifle, revolver, and every cartridge he owned. But when he rode out of the yard, he was not alone. At the edge of the property, a figure stepped into the road. Declan O'Malley, an Irish ranch hand from a neighboring spread, wiry and sharp-eyed, his hat pulled low. Behind him came Two Hawks, a Lakota scout whose quiet strength had earned Eli's respect years ago during a cattle drive. "We heard," O'Malley said simply. "You'll not ride into hell alone." Eli's throat tightened. He wanted to refuse, to keep them from danger, but the truth was written plain. He could not do this alone. He nodded once, and without another word, the three men spurred their horses into the dark. The trail led west, toward the broken teeth of the canyon country, where shadows lay deep and ambush waited around every bend. They rode through the night, the air sharp with cold, their breath steaming in the moonlight. No one spoke. The only sound was the steady rhythm of hooves and the whisper of wind across the snow. Each mile carried them deeper into outlaw land, where lawmen feared to tread and only the bold or the damned survived. By dawn they reached the canyon rim. Smoke curled from a hollow below, the faint murmur of voices drifting upward. Murdoch's camp. Eli dismounted, crouching low, eyes fixed on the cluster of tents and fires. And there, roped to a post, her dress torn, her hair wild in the wind, was Clara. She sat upright, chin high despite the bruises on her arms, defiance blazing in her eyes. Relief and fury surged through Eli in equal measure. O'Malley spat into the dirt. "Outnumbered 5-1, maybe more. We'd best wait for night." Eli shook his head. "No waiting. Every hour she's down there is another they can hurt her. I ride now." Two Hawks laid a hand on his shoulder, silent but steady. His gaze was calm, unblinking, as if to say, "Then we ride together." They moved like shadows down the canyon slope, rifles ready, the chill air heavy with tension. Murdoch's men lounged by the fire, laughing, passing a bottle between them. None noticed until the first shot cracked across the camp, felling a man where he sat. Chaos erupted, shouts, horses screaming, gunfire exploding in every direction. Eli charged straight through the smoke, eyes locked on Clara. Bullets whined past his ears, dirt spraying at his feet. He fired back, every shot fueled by 10 years of rage and loss, dropping another outlaw as he reached the post. "Eli," Clara cried, her voice raw. He cut her ropes with a knife, pulling her into his arms. For an instant they clung together, her face pressed against his chest, his heart pounding with relief. But the battle was far from over. Murdoch emerged from the smoke, shotgun in hand, his grin savage. "You should have stayed in your grave, rancher," he snarled. "Now I'll put you in one." The two men faced each other across the firelight, the world narrowing to the space between them. Eli's revolver was empty, his rifle lost in the charge. All that remained was the knife in his hand and the fury in his heart. Murdoch raised the shotgun, finger tightening on the trigger. But Clara moved first. She snatched up the Winchester from the dirt, aimed with steady hands born of desperation, and fired. The shot struck Murdoch square in the chest, the force hurling him backward into the flames. His scream tore through the canyon, then was swallowed by the fire and the smoke. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of burning canvas. The remaining outlaws fled into the shadows, their courage shattered. O'Malley whooped in triumph. Two Hawks lifted his chin in grim acknowledgement, but Eli heard none of it. He held Clara against him, trembling with the weight of what had nearly been lost. "You saved me," she whispered, tears streaking her soot-stained face. He shook his head fiercely, voice breaking. "No, you saved me. You've been saving me since the day you stepped off that stagecoach." And there, amid the ruin of Murdoch's camp, he pressed his forehead to hers, his lips brushing her hair, his heart at last unshackled from the grave. Justice had been served in blood, but what it left behind was something greater, something worth living for. Redemption under the wide sky. The canyon stank of smoke and blood long after the last outlaw fled. Eli, O'Malley, and Two Hawks buried the dead in shallow graves beneath the cottonwoods, their spades biting into hard earth as ravens circled overhead. Justice on the frontier seldom left room for ceremony, yet each body lowered into the ground carried the weight of hard choices, of violence made necessary. When the final mound of dirt was packed, silence settled heavy over the camp, broken only by the crackle of dying embers. Clara stood apart, her shawl drawn tight against the cold, her gaze fixed on the flames where Murdoch had fallen. She had not spoken since the shot that ended him. Eli watched her, his heart aching at the shadows etched across her face. She had killed to save him. He would carry the burden of that knowledge for both of them, but he knew she would never escape the memory of the outlaw's scream or the smell of his burning flesh. The frontier demanded blood for survival, but it demanded something else too, the strength to live with what bloodshed left behind. At dawn, they rode back to the ranch. The land stretched endless and silent, snow glittering under the rising sun as though the earth itself had been scrubbed clean. Yet when they crested the ridge and the charred skeleton of the barn came into view, reality returned like a blow. The ranch bore the scars of fire, cattle huddled tight in the yard, fences broken and scattered. What had once stood as Eli's fortress of solitude now lay bare and wounded, a mirror of the man himself. Neighbors came in trickles once word spread. Some offered aid, lumber, nails, strong backs to raise a new barn. Others came only to watch, their eyes sharp with judgment, their whispers sharper still. The tale of Clara's abduction had already woven itself into rumor, that she had brought ruin upon the ranch, that Eli had risked damnation to save a woman who was never his to claim. In a land where survival depended on a man standing, such whispers were poison. Eli felt the weight of them every time he rode into town. The saloon fell silent when he entered. The church pews shifted uneasily when he walked the aisle. Men muttered that he had taken his wife's sister into his bed, that God himself would strike the ranch with plague or famine. Yet he held his head high, though each word cut deeper than any bullet. What steadied him was not his pride, nor his anger, but the sight of Clara each morning, her hands raw from work, her face lifted to the rising sun with quiet resolve. One evening, as they stood together by the cottonwood that shaded his wife's grave, Clara placed her hand gently in his. The stone was worn smooth by wind and weather, the name half faded, but Eli could still see it clearly. Mary Granger, beloved wife. His chest tightened with guilt, the old wound reopening. She would hate me for this, he whispered, voice rough. Clara's hand tightened around his. No, she said softly but firmly. She loved you, Eli. And if love means anything, it means wanting you to live, not just survive. She would want you to be whole again. He turned toward her, eyes burning. For 10 years he had kept that grave like an altar, guarding his sorrow as though it were sacred. Now standing beside Clara, he felt the chains of grief loosen. Not gone, never gone, but changed, reshaped into something that no longer bound him. He pressed his forehead to Clara's, his breath shuddering. You've given me back my life, he whispered. Her tears mingled with his, and in that quiet moment beneath the wide western sky, their love became not a secret shame but a truth neither could deny. Spring came slow that year, but it came. The barn rose again with the help of neighbors whose judgment softened when they saw Clara's tireless hands hauling beams, her laughter carrying across the yard despite the gossip. The cattle grew fat on fresh grass, calves born strong and bawling. The ranch, scarred but unbroken, began to breathe again, and with the thaw came a change in the town. Where once people whispered of scandal, they began to speak of courage. They remembered Clara standing unflinching against Murdoch's gang, rifle steady, eyes fierce. They remembered Eli riding into outlaw country to bring her back. The story twisted as all stories do, until what remained was not gossip but legend. The widowed rancher and the woman who saved him, who together defied the odds and carved a future from the ashes. One Sunday morning, Eli and Clara walked into the church side by side. The pews rustled, heads turned, whispers rose. But when they reached the front, Eli turned not to the preacher but to the people. His voice rang steady, stronger than it had in years. I buried my wife 10 years ago, he said, each word cutting through the murmurs. I thought my heart died with her. But this land teaches a man to endure, and endurance means more than silence. It means finding the strength to live again. Clara has stood beside me through fire and blood. She is my family, My partner, my future, and if any man here calls that sin, let him be the one to cast the first stone." Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Then slowly a few men nodded. A woman dabbed at her eyes. The preacher's mouth thinned, but he said nothing. And in that silence, Eli knew the tide had turned. On the first warm morning of summer, Eli and Clara stood on the porch of the rebuilt ranch house, watching the sun spill gold across the valley. The cattle moved like dark waves in the distance. The cottonwoods rustled with new leaves, and the air carried the promise of rain. Clara leaned against him, her hand resting lightly on his chest. "After 10 years alone," she murmured, her voice soft with wonder. "Do you ever think you'd come to this?" Eli slipped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. He looked out across the land, across the graves and the scars and the new beginnings, and felt the weight of it all settle into something like peace. "No," he said simply, "but it's where I belong." She tilted her face toward his, and when their lips met, it was not with the desperation of fire or grief, but with the quiet certainty of love that had endured trial and found redemption. The wind swept across the valley, carrying their laughter with it, mingling with the lowing of cattle and the cry of hawks overhead. The ranch was no longer a place of silence, no longer a graveyard of memories. It was a home, their home. And under the wide western sky, Eli Granger, once a ghost among the living, finally stepped into the light of life again, no longer alone,